Welcome back, Notre Dame fans, IB Nation, which are kind of all in the same. But I realize is not all of IB Nation are necessarily Notre Dame fans. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Georgia fans who might be listening to this broadcast. We are, Trevor, now less than a week away from the Sugar Bowl. Notre Dame against Georgia. I believe they finished the season 2-5, correct? Georgia was ranked second. Notre Dame was ranked fifth. The 11-2 Georgia Bulldogs against the 12-1 Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Trevor, I am so excited for this game. Huge matchup. We're going to preview the matchup of the Notre Dame offense against the Georgia defense. When we're done with that, we're going to talk about the new portal pickups that Notre Dame got since our last show, where they picked up wide receiver Will Pauling from Wisconsin, and then also they picked up a tight end yesterday that, honestly, as much as I have a lot of intel about transfers, Trev, I hadn't heard that name at all until he announced his commitment. So that one got me. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what that commitment means. But the big part of today's show, Trev, is this matchup between the Notre Dame offense and the Georgia defense. We'll talk about the other side of the ball tomorrow, and both sides are important. Special teams is going to be important when you get on this stage. But this, to me, Trev, is the most intriguing matchup of this game because this is the perceived strength of Georgia against the perceived weakness of Notre Dame, right? Concern area for Notre Dame. And how this, we've said it before, we're going to really dive into it today, but how this part of the game goes, in my opinion, is ultimately going to determine the winner, which is the difference between what we saw with, for example, Ole Miss and Alabama against Georgia. Those offenses played well. And then what we saw from Clemson and Texas, where those offenses struggled against Georgia. Which one is Notre Dame going to be? We're going to find out, Trev, in 6 days. But this matchup is going to be incredibly, incredibly important. And I cannot wait to talk about it because, man, I'm so fired up for this game, Trev. So fired up.
I'm with you, man. I mean, we haven't really had a whole lot of shows diving into this matchup specifically, but I'm still already to the point where it's like I'm tired of talking about it. You know what I mean? Like I'm ready to watch it. I'm ready to watch it go down. And I'm still riding a little bit of the high from the Notre Dame Indiana game. I mean, as you can tell by the sound of my voice, I was definitely in the stands, chilling out in 20-degree weather, and but it was worth it, right? But I mean, it's crazy to think that in a week from today, we're going to be having one of two conversations, right? And depending on the outcome of the game, it's going to be very different. And it does come down to Notre Dame's offense versus Georgia's defense, man. I'm ready to talk about it. I'm ready to confirm some things that we've been talking about. I'm ready to put some narratives to rest. It's going to be a really fun show. I'm excited to start diving into this matchup specifically, Bryan.
Well, that's how excited Trevor is. He tells me he's sick today, and it's not like a, hey, man, I may not be able to go today, or, hey, man, I might need you to cover me a little bit, or it was just like, just letting you know, let's do this. I'm sick, but I'm ready to roll because this is a big game, Trevor. I would argue this is the biggest game that Notre Dame has played since 2018 against Clemson. And you could say the 2020 Sugar Bowl, but there was just something about that game, Trevor. I don't know. I just never looked at that game as the same way. Never really felt like that Notre Dame team was going to win at all. If they did somehow upset Alabama, they were going to get beat in the next round, whether it was Clemson, another game against Clemson and Trevor Lawrence, and then or against Ohio State. But this is the first time I've really felt Notre Dame is on this stage against one of the quote-unquote blue blood, or not, I shouldn't say blue blood, because I don't know that Clemson is a traditional blue blood, but against a powerhouse program, a team that within the last 2 to 3 years has won a championship, which Clemson had in 2018. They were 2 years removed from their 2016 championship, and they were about to win another one. It was a legitimate title contender. Obviously, Clemson won it all that year. I've seen people say, I don't necessarily disagree, although I'm not as on board with this as others, but the winner of this game is going to win a title, is going to win it all. I think the winner of this game is going to play for the championship. I think Ohio State and Oregon might have a little something to say about who's going to win the title, maybe even Texas a little bit. But, this is a legitimate championship caliber football team in Georgia. And this is Notre Dame's chance to show if they are or are not that caliber program as well. We've talked a lot about that. But this matchup, in my opinion, is ultimately going to determine if Notre Dame is different, because this is the side of the ball that has held Notre Dame back, Trevor, right? We talked last week about that meme that was going up about, Notre Dame scored 27 points in their playoff game, and, Brian Kelly's two teams, in the playoffs scored 17 points. And I'm like, okay, true, but as much as I've said, look, Indiana's a really good football team. There's no doubt they belonged in the playoffs. That was a heck of a win for Notre Dame. But, folks, that Indiana team was ranked 10th in the final rankings, 9th, 10th in the final rankings. It's not the same as number 1 Clemson or number 1 Alabama in 2020 and 2018, right? I mean, this is that kind of test, right? Like, this is that kind of test, Trevor, where your offense has to step up and play. Yeah, it's great you did what you did against Indiana, and Notre Dame left a lot of points on the board, but this is a whole different animal when you talk about playing as Georgia defense. And so this Notre Dame offense, just kind of big picture, Trev, before we get into the particulars, is going to have to play at its best. And as I said, it's in a matchup where it's the perceived weak spot of the Notre Dame offense or Notre Dame team, right? Of, like the defense is great, but the offense, I mean, how good is the offense really? They can't throw the ball. They're this, they're that, this is the other thing, against what is perceived as the strength of the Georgia defense. Because look at all those first rounders they have over there, which they do, right? And that's what I think adds a little bit of intrigue to this matchup.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of friends about the Notre Dame Indiana game, and from a magnitude standpoint, it's the biggest game that they have won since '93, right? But that's the level of the game. First round of the playoffs, first playoff win for Notre Dame. Yes, it's the first year of the 12-team playoff, but the 4-team playoff has been happening over the last decade, right? And so from a magnitude perspective, it is the biggest game. It's not the biggest opponent. You know what I'm saying? Like if Notre Dame played Indiana in the regular season, right? I don't think they walk away from that being like, this is the biggest Notre Dame win since 1993.
100%.
Right. And that's no discredit to Indiana, right? I'm with you. They deserve to be in the playoffs. They deserve to be in the spot that they were in. But then when you compare it to this Georgia matchup, right? Because you referenced, the graphic of, Notre Dame just, doubled their points or whatever it was in their previous 2 playoff matchups. And yes, those were on neutral sites. Notre Dame versus Indiana was at home. And when you compare the caliber of opponents between 2018 Clemson and 2020 Bama, IU's not really there, right? Now, I don't think that this 2024 Georgia team is 2018 Clemson, 2020 Bama.
Nobody
either.
Remaining in the college football playoff right now, of all the 8 teams, none of them are 2018 Clemson.
100%.
Right.
100%. But this is the biggest, not only is it biggest magnitude because you can get that monkey off your back if you haven't won a New Year's Six bowl in a while, but this will also be that big opponent. I talked in our last show about, really you can go back to 2005 and Notre Dame hasn't beaten this caliber of opponent. There's been some, like you think about 2020 Clemson, right? When they were ranked number 1 in the country, I believe. But they didn't have Trevor Lawrence, and then Trevor Lawrence played in the ACC
Mike Jones.
championship.
They didn't have 3 starters from their defense because of the COVID stuff.
Right. And then fast forward to the ACC championship when they were back and healthy and ready to go. We kind of know what happens there, right? And so,
not pretty.
Unfortunately, we remember and we know what happens. But this is a game where this is the one. This is the one that this is the narrative of Notre Dame can't win those big games. And that's what feeds into this, man. And not only will it be, a big win for Notre Dame, they're advancing to the semifinals, and playing one of Penn State and Boise State. And you could make the argument that, again, no disrespect to Boise State or Penn State, but I think Georgia's a more of a championship caliber team than those two. So you could make the argument that the path gets a little less tough. I don't want to call it easy because it's the playoffs. Nothing in the playoffs is easy, right? But you can go through and you look and they get the monkey off the back if they haven't won a playoff game. Now they have the opportunity to get that off the back with having to overcome that Georgia team, which, Brian, you've talked about, is in order to be the best, you got to beat the best. You know what I mean? And we're talking about Notre Dame going up against a team that's won the national championship 2 out of the last 3 years. So this is going to be a fun one to break down, man.
So let's talk about the matchup, Trevor. We mentioned it already. Perceived, not. I shouldn't even. I guess weakness might even be a little strong. It's not considered the strength of the Notre Dame football team, and has been considered this is the side of the ball that's going to get you beat if you don't advance. And there's a reason that there's that perception, Trevor, because the offense has not necessarily played great in some of the bigger games this year. They didn't play. They did what was needed against Texas A&M. This is going to be another game you need to do that. They did not play well against Northern Illinois. For the rest of the season, they have done what they've needed to do, but they haven't done it against a caliber of opponent like Georgia. And as we've said before, Trev, when you look at the big games that Georgia has played this year, right? You look at the best teams that they've played this year, and Georgia's played in some big games this year. There's no doubt. They've played twice against Texas. They've played against Clemson. They've played against Alabama. They've played against Ole Miss. They've played against Tennessee. In the games where the opposing offense played well, they got beat. I mean, it's just simple as that. They got beat. Ole Miss's offense played well, and they moved the ball on Georgia to the tune of 396 yards and 6.2 yards per play, and they beat Georgia 28-10. Alabama had 547 yards, 8.4 per play, and they beat them 41-34. Even a game like Mississippi State, where Georgia won 41 they gave up 31 points, 385 yards, and 6.1 yards per play in that game. The Georgia Tech game, where they had to win big and win in overtime 44-42, they gave up 563 yards and 6.7 yards per play. In games where maybe they were better, where the opposing offenses didn't play well, Georgia won. Clemson only 188 yards of offense, 3.6 per play. Texas only had 259 yards of offense, 3.4 point yards per play in the regular season game. And then Texas did go for 5.3 yards per play and 389 in the SEC championship, but most of that was through the air. They couldn't run the football. And when the game was on the line, that inability to run the football is why you couldn't punch the ball in the end zone when they did get into the red zone in that game. And that was ultimately the difference of the game is, Texas got into the red zone 3 times against Georgia. 3 times. They came away with 0 touchdowns in those 3 drives. That's the ball game right there. That's the game. And so this Notre Dame offense is going to have to step up and be better than that. There's no question. I mean, look, Ole Miss got into the red zone 5 times. They only got 2 touchdowns, but those 2 touchdowns were the difference, big difference in the game. They weren't selling for field goals, which helped them put some distance between the 2. And so that's going to be a really, really big. Bama, 3 of 5 of their red zone drives resulted in touchdowns. Mississippi State, all 3 of their red zone drives resulted in touchdowns. So there's a lot of different aspects. But if Notre Dame is going to win this game, barring just an unbelievable lights-out performance by the Notre Dame defense, the offense is going to have to play good football. What does that mean, Trevor? That's the thing we'll talk about first. It does not mean Notre Dame's got to go and hang a 40 spot on Georgia. That's not what we're saying. If that's needed, then this Notre Dame defense has a horrible performance. You never know. That may happen. But what we're talking about is if we expect all units to kind of play relatively well within reason, we're talking about how this team's got to get between 24 to 30 points is what I believe is going to be enough to win the game. Somewhere in that region. And for the most part, that's been true. I mean, I know that the Clemson game ended up being 34-3, but that was a 6-0 game at halftime, Trevor. And that game got a little bit out of hand late. Georgia popped a couple on the board late because Clemson couldn't do anything offensively. But that was a competitive game to halftime, 6-0 game at halftime. And then second half, Georgia pulled away because the Clemson defense, you can't keep Georgia down for 60 minutes, man. Eventually they're going to get something going. And when your offense is doing nothing, you're going to be in trouble. But that's what I think, Trev, about this offense. It doesn't have to be 450 yards and 35 to 45 points. It just needs to be 24 to 30 is kind of that range that you've got to be able to get somewhere in there. If your defense does what it should do, that's where it's at. And even something like a 24 to 27 could be enough if your defense comes to play, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow. What do you think?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's, I'll start with the amount of Georgia film that I've watched over the past couple days, right? Like we're coming off of the holiday, but let's call a spade here. We all have a lot of downtime over the holidays. And so I watched a little bit of Georgia film over Christmas, right? And one of the biggest takeaways that I've had against, the Georgia-Texas games in both matchups is Texas's inability to take advantage of opportunities. You look at the first matchup, Carson Beck throws 3 interceptions. 3. And Texas scored 15 points in 1 quarter. You know what I mean? Like it's just, you look at the second matchup in the SEC championship game, you get to the red zone 3 times, and so when I look at what Notre Dame's offense has to do is it's take advantage of those opportunities. If there's anything that we know about Notre Dame's defense by now, which like you said, we're going to dive into later, but if there's anything that I know about Notre Dame's defense, it's going to give your offense multiple opportunities to capitalize on whatever opportunity that is, whether it be a short field or a turnover on downs or something, And so Notre Dame's offense, for the most part this year, has done a relatively good job of that. And we've seen them perform in spurts of how they're going to have to play for a full 60 minutes against Georgia on New Year's Day, right? I mean, you have the examples of, the fourth quarter in the Texas A&M game, the first half, really first quarter of Louisville, quarters 2 and 3 versus USC. So you have those examples, but the biggest question marks for me is, can it be fully put together? Because, let's be honest, they didn't even put together like a 4-quarter game against Indiana either. There was a lot left to be desired after that performance, and so can they do it against a defense like Georgia's?
Would you say 2 strong quarters and then kind of put Indiana away a little bit on that last drive in the fourth quarter? That's how I look at it.
Yep, I'm the exact same way.
So, Trev, I look at this matchup and let's dive into the numbers to add some context to what we're talking about here. This is an interesting part of this matchup. So you look at Notre Dame versus Georgia. Notre Dame has the offense is considered not the strength of the team, but yet they rank 4th in the country in points at 38.8. Now that's aided by the fact Notre Dame has 6 defensive touchdowns. But as we broke down when we were talking about the Indian game, they're still over 36 points per game. They're still a top 15 scoring offense if you take away any non-offensive scoring from that game. They rank 41st in total offense, but they rank 13th in yards per play. Why the difference? Field position. That's what it boils down to, is field position. Notre Dame's scoring on some short fields. That's why their yards per play is high and their yards per game is low. Red zone offense, they're at 79, ranked 79th in the country, but they are 14th in red zone offense. I had to double check that. I was like, did I get that wrong? And a lot of that, as we've talked about, Trevor, is they've taken a lot of knees late in games inside the 20. I think 5 times I've counted this year where Notre Dame has ended a drive inside the red zone where they took a knee or ran the clock out at the end of a game inside the other team's red zone. Third down offense, Notre Dame is 70th. That's actually up, Trev, because they just had arguably their best. It wasn't their highest percentage third down performance, but to me it was their best third down performance of the season when you consider how good Indiana's defense was, ranked 8th in the country in third down defense coming into that game.
Sure.
Notre Dame ranks 48th in yards of 30 gains of 30 yards or more, and they're 28th in fewest turnovers allowed. Flip the script a little bit. Look at Georgia. Bulldogs rank 21st in the country in scoring. They rank 35th in total defense, 38th in yards per play. These 2 numbers right here are interesting. They're 69th in red zone defense, but they're 11th in red zone touchdown defense. So both of these teams have that weird stat of they actually allow teams to score at a pretty high level in the red zone, and then Notre Dame scores at a relatively lower level in the red zone, but they are both really good in their respective categories in touchdowns. Notre Dame scoring them and Georgia not giving them up, which I thought was interesting. Another good third down defense that Notre Dame is going to have to face. They're 23rd. They are 61st in gains of 30 yards allowed or more. They've given up 22, which is going to be a very interesting part of this game. And then Georgia ranks 44th in the country with only 19 turnovers gained. I think that part of it, Trevor, is a very fascinating part. And a lot of what you're going to hear is, well, they've played a tougher schedule. And I'm like, well, that's true. But what's interesting is they've kind of dominated some of their tougher schedule. I mean, I looked at this. So I looked at how their opponents rank in the Fermo Efficiency Index and then the Football Power Index. And they played, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams that rank in the top 25 in scoring or in offensive efficiency. It's Clemson, Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss, Georgia Tech. Now, it's 5 teams, 6 games is actually how it is because they've played Texas twice. And in those games, you've seen this mismatch of performance, right? Where at times they've looked good on defense against those teams and at times they haven't. Clemson ranks 11th, and they performed incredibly well in that game on defense. Ole Miss ranks 10th. They didn't play great on defense. Georgia Tech ranks 23rd. They played terrible on defense. Alabama ranks 18th, and they played really poorly on defense. But against Clemson, as I mentioned, then against Texas, who has the number 17 offense in the country on the Fermo efficiency index. They dominated them twice, in my opinion. FPI tells the same story. Trevor, the same teams are top 25. And Tennessee has the number 33 offense in the FEI, and they had two different halves. First half, they give up 17 points, allowed Tennessee to run all over them. Second half, they completely dominated Tennessee in the second half.
Yeah.
Made adjustments at halftime, and Tennessee had no answers for Georgia in the second half. And so it's been a bit of an up and down performance. And then you could say the same for Notre Dame when they've played good defenses. At times they've played good defenses that they tore up. At times they've played good defenses where they didn't necessarily play as well. Northern Illinois has one of the highest ranked defenses in the country, and Notre Dame struggled against them. And they have far inferior talent to Notre Dame. They played better against Texas A&M, but not great by any stretch of the imagination. Had a lot of missed opportunities in that game. Did very well against Louisville when they were trying to score on Louisville. USC has a defense that ranked relatively high coming into that game. They had played 6 games in a row, tore that defense up. And then, as you mentioned, against Indiana, really good first half, not very good second half. How are they going to perform here? So these are two units that have been challenged this season by other good units. Army obviously has a very highly ranked defense. Notre Dame tore that up. Navy had a pretty highly ranked defense coming into that game. They tore that up. Those are different levels. They're not on the level of Georgia just from a pure talent standpoint. But those are things you look at, Trev, and say, man, this is going to be an interesting battle because these are two teams that rank relatively well in most categories, but also teams that have been up and down in their performance this season.
You know, these are two teams where when certain people have takes on them, right, it goes to show who just pays attention to these numbers right here and who's watched these teams play, right? Like I think that's a lot of what goes into this matchup because there's some people that will just look at the numbers and say, well, Notre Dame's not great in the red zone. They rank 79th and all this other stuff. And then you broke it down perfectly. Like they've had missed field goals in the red zone. They take knees in the red zone, and which technically goes against your red zone offense if you're running plays inside of the 20-yard line, right? But then you go and you look at things like touchdown percentage, where they're 14th in the country. And, you know, same thing with Georgia's. And so it's on either side, whether it's people for or against Notre Dame, it's evident to see who's watched Notre Dame play, who's watched Georgia play, and who's kind of just like the stat sheet warrior and just paying attention to what the numbers say. Right. So no, but from a matchup standpoint, that's what makes it interesting is this side of the ball for either team. When they're cooking, they're cooking. You know what I mean? And when they're off, they are off. And so it's going to be a big picture story of what wins the day.
Right.
You know, who's going to be the most consistent team. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a question of who's the most ready, who's the most up for this game. Both teams will be.
These are two really well-coached football teams and very talented football teams that have been on big stages. They'll both be ready.
100%.
It's going to be about execution, to your point, Trev. 100%.
Yep. Who's gonna execute at the highest level? Who's going to execute at the most consistent level? Because that is what these numbers show us, right? 22 plays of 30 yards or longer. I'll add even more context into that. 17 of those came through the air. And I know we're going to talk about that later today, but it's just about consistency, right? You look at Notre Dame, it's, they only have 26 plays of 30 yards or more. 26 plays of 30 yards or more. I guarantee you the bulk of that 26 came across like 4 games. You know what I mean?
Well, and it's a lot of it's on the ground.
Yeah.
As you can see there.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to that one for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's an interesting matchup when you look at it as a whole. It's weird to hear the narrative that like Notre Dame's offense struggles, but they're the 4th team in the country in points per game.
Yeah.
But also the same thing with Georgia. You hear like this is a shell of a former Georgia defense, and there is some truth to that, but they still only allow 20 points a game.
Yeah.
You look and see what they did to Texas. They held Texas to a combined 60 yards rushing across 2 games, And so you look at it and it's what's the narrative and then like what's the facts, right? Notre Dame's offense struggles. Yeah, well, they're 1.2 points off of averaging 40 points a game. Georgia's defense can't stop anybody. It's like, well, over the course of 13 games, they've held teams to an average of 20.4 points. So like they can, it's just, you can't only look at the Alabama game and the Georgia Tech game, right? You also have to factor in what they did to Texas and what they did to Tennessee. So it's going to be an interesting matchup, man. I'm excited to dive into it into more detail.
Here's an interesting statistic for you, and I don't know how much this is going to mean, but if you look at not stats, but efficiency, right, and power rankings. So if you look at the Fremeau Efficiency Index, which I like to use, the Bryan Fremeau uses. I believe I introduced you to Bryan with the Virginia game, correct? He was there. And if you look at the Football Power Index at ESPN, Georgia this year played 5 teams that ranked in the top 20 in offense and defense. They went 3-2 in those games, beat Clemson and Texas twice, lost to Bama and Ole Miss. In the Fremeau Efficiency Index, they played one team that ranked in the top 15 in both. That was Ole Miss, who ranked 10th and 7th. They lost to them 28-10. They played 2 teams that ranked in the top 15 in both. In the Football Power Index, that was Bama and Ole Miss. They went 0-2. Notre Dame ranks 7th on offense and 1st on defense in the Fremeau Efficiency Index. That is the number 1 ranked offense from an efficiency standpoint that Georgia will have faced all year. Now, the context of that is all those teams have played Georgia, right? And so, like Notre Dame's defense, that's going to drag it down a little bit. But Notre Dame has the number 1 efficiency defense in the FEI and number 2 in the Football Power Index. They're number 11 on offense in the Football Power Index from ESPN. That's the second best offense they'll face, with Clemson being number 1. You and I would both argue that Clemson's FPI is generated primarily off of just destroying really bad teams. They've struggled against all the good defenses they've played. But I thought that put into context a little bit. Georgia Tech has their offense is 23rd and 19th in efficiency, and they had some success, certainly had some success against this Georgia team, but their defense ranks 45th and 49th. They don't have the kind of defense that Notre Dame has. Tennessee has a top 20 defense, but their offense ranks 33rd and 29th. So their offense isn't on that level. Georgia, who gave Texas's defense offensive problems, ranks 25th and 19th on defense, but their offense ranks 48th. So even though that a lot of people look at this Notre Dame offense as a perceived weakness, all the efficiency numbers, all the power rankings numbers, all that kind of stuff, which in the past have shown that Notre Dame's offense wasn't as good as people thought it was, because, again, it looks at who you played. There's been years in the past where Notre Dame scored some points and did some good things, but they would never rank as high on like the efficiency numbers because a lot of times, Trev, if we're being honest, they beat up on bad teams. And this year, the numbers show that Notre Dame is, from an efficiency standpoint, relative to this is, and these things are relative to your competition. It takes those things into consideration. You see this Notre Dame offense is ranked much higher than people think. And I think a lot of the reason that people, I don't think, respect this offense the way that it does is because I think a lot of people that don't actually watch outside of the Power Five don't understand how good the non-Power Five teams Notre Dame played this year are. For context, Trevor, last year Notre Dame's offense on the FEI ranked 17th in college football, just to give some context to where it is now, and that is with them playing a great game in the bowl game to raise that up. So certainly a different type of performance from Notre Dame, or different type of offense this year. In 2022, Notre Dame ranked 41st in offensive efficiency. So it's been a while since Notre Dame had an offense that ranked this high, not just in stats and yards per game and points per game, or yards per play and points per game and all that kind of stuff, but just looking at it from the standpoint of efficiency as well. It's been a long time since Notre Dame ranked that high. 21, they ranked 22nd. In 2020, the offense ranked 19th. In 2019, the offense ranked 27th. In 2018, the offense ranked 25th, right? So, I mean, again, we're going back a long time. 2027, where were they in 11th? 11th in 2027 is the 2017 is the highest they've ranked on offense. So this number 7 ranking puts into context how good this offense has been this year. And it's related to the quality of the competition. And I thought that was worth pointing out, how good it's been, and to what that means. Okay, so like you look at like Miami this year, who had the number 1 ranked scoring offense in the country. Indiana had the number 2 scoring offense in the country. Indiana ranks 7th in offensive efficiency. Miami ranks 10th. So it's not just about looking at raw numbers. It's how did you do relative to the competition? And I thought that put some very interesting context into this Notre Dame team and what Georgia's going to be facing. On the flip side of that, Trev, if you look at Georgia, and by the way, it just overall FEI, from Notre Dame is the number 3 team in the country. Indiana's 7, Georgia's 8, which I thought was very interesting. But if you look at Georgia's offense, they're 9th in the FEI. And Notre Dame is 7th. And then defensively, as I said on the FEI, Notre Dame is number 1 and Georgia is number 13. So if you look at the FEI rankings, this is the number 7 offense in the country against the number 13 defense in the country, which means, as we've said, they're both really good. Which one carries the day? We're going to find that out. Because you know what the response is going to be. Well, yeah, but you didn't have to do that playing SEC teams week after week after week after week. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. You know, we'll see what Notre Dame can do about that this week. Because, look, playing the SEC every week is not like playing the ACC every week. I can admit that.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think we also need to stop assuming that every team in the SEC is good. And that's the issue with that conversation. So anyway, Trev, I thought those numbers made for a very interesting perspective on this matchup.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Notre Dame has a narrative that it does is because of the style of their offense. It's because they don't have this aired out, offense with Tez Johnson or Jeremiah Smith or Ryan Williams. And, they're not throwing for 300 yards a game. And I think people just still associate that with, well, they're just not a high powered offense. This isn't me taking stabs at anybody. This is just, these are stats. These are numbers. I'm pretty sure if I walked around the street and I asked people who has a better offense, Notre Dame or Ohio State, people are just going to look me dead in the face, laugh and say Ohio State because they have Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith and Travion Henderson. Well, Notre Dame averages more points per game. Ohio State right now is the number 11 team in the country. Notre Dame is the 4th. You look at their rushing yards per game. And everybody talks about, who has the best running back doing the country? Oh, it's Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. I mean, look at that. They have the number 58 rushing offense in the country right now. Like I said, part of the perception is just what it looks like for Notre Dame. Yeah. Like if I guarantee you the narrative is going to be different next year. If they have somebody, starting, whether it be Kenny or CJ or Steve or whoever, and they're able to pass the ball more, that's when the narrative comes in of, man, this Notre Dame offense is lethal.
Scary good. Yeah.
And I guarantee you they could average less points per game, less total yards per game, not be as efficient and not be as balanced. Yeah. But if they're able to just pass the ball and it just looks super awesome, people, oh man, I mean, this is just a dangerous. But then Notre Dame's a run heavy team and people are like, I mean, yeah, Jeremiah Love's good, but it's still not like a good elite offense yet.
But if he's all you got, then you're going to be in trouble. Yeah.
It's narratives, man. It's all narratives.
Well, Trev, it's interesting you say that because I had to listen to some of that talk when we were leading up to the Indiana game. And I look at Curtis Rourke on the year, and I had a lot of people nationally ranked Curtis Rourke as a better player than Riley Leonard. And I found that kind of funny. If you look at the season totals, now again, Curtis Rourke played one fewer game than Riley Leonard, but Riley Leonard didn't play a lot of football in a lot of games that Notre Dame played this year. But if you look at the numbers, it kind of tells an interesting story, Trev, because you'll find out that Notre Dame, Riley Leonard was actually pretty productive this season. He just, he did it in a different kind of way. I mean, Curtis Rourke this year played 711 snaps. This is the point I'm trying to make. He played 711 snaps. Yes, he played one fewer game, but he played 711 snaps because, as we mentioned, Notre Dame had a lot of blowouts where Riley Leonard didn't play in the second half. Riley Leonard only played 751 snaps. So that was, even though he played one more game, it's only 40 more snaps. And if you look at the total offense, Curtis Rourke had 3,007. Riley Leonard had 344. Curtis Rourke this year accounted for 31 touchdowns. Riley Leonard's accounted for 32. The difference is Curtis Rourke did all his in the air. He had 3,042 passing yards, minus 35 rushing yards. But Riley Leonard threw for 2,293 yards and ran for 751. So it's perceived not as good because it's rushing. And that's the thing that I kind of find a little frustrating is it's a style thing, not an effectiveness thing. And I find that whole conversation to be really annoying. Like, man, if they had Carson Beck, you'd really be in a lot of trouble. Okay, Carson Beck's a heck of a player. Carson Beck accounted for 29 touchdowns this year, and I think 14 turnovers, right? 2 fumbles, 12 picks, or was it 13? 12 picks. Riley Leonard had 7 turnovers and 32 touchdowns. So Riley Leonard accounts for more touchdowns in the same amount of games, but he's not considered as effective because he doesn't throw it the way that other people do. Yards are yards and points are points. That's what it comes down to. And it seems like opposing coaches talk a lot higher about Riley Leonard than Notre Dame fans, some Notre Dame fans, although a lot are coming around, but then, of course, opposing fan bases, because, again, it's done in a way that people don't perceive to be, as effective.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like you said, I don't care if Riley Leonard picks up 10 first downs a game through the air or 10 first downs in a game with his legs. It's just as effective. It moves the chains. I mean, it's just, like I said, I've been on this train that entire year, man. All year I have been. So, but you're right. It's all about perspective. It's all about your perspective, and it's all about, it's a stylistic difference. It has nothing to do with what makes the offense more efficient.
I was confused by something too, Trevor. When we were watching the Stanford game, I was wondering why Notre Dame didn't have more than 49 points. Because Riley Leonard threw for 3 touchdowns in that game, and I was under the impression that passing touchdowns counted for more than rushing touchdowns. So I was a little surprised, and they only gave him 6 every time he threw a touchdown pass. It's very weird. Very weird. But when you see that and you just see total yards and total touchdowns, I think it puts it into perspective of what they are. That doesn't mean that they don't have to throw the football, and we'll jump into that. But it just kind of shows that, that this isn't just the Jeremiah Love show. This offense has a lot of different weapons, and they're going to need all of them to be at their best when we get to this matchup. So that's going to do it for an overview of the offense. We're going to dive into the run game next, and then we'll dive more specifically into the pass game. And then, of course, we'll break down the transfers next. But before we do, folks, you see that little thumbs up button right below us? Go ahead and hit that like button for us. We would greatly appreciate that. Make sure you turn on your notifications. And, of course, if you're a member of the message board or you follow me on Twitter, you'll see every day that we post our show and what time it'll go. So if notifications aren't showing up on your phone for some reason, check the message board. We'll have them on there. We'll be live the next 2 days as well, Friday and Saturday. And then we'll be back on Monday with another live show at 1 o'clock as we get closer and closer and closer to this game, Trev. I'm looking forward to it a ton. So we'll get to the run game next.